Now, fast forward to the Defence Force that we have. Yes, we're spending just around 2%. A lot of that 2%, though, and you've touched on this, is not the 2% that Mr Morrison left when he left office in 22. That's been hollowed out to pay for, and I'm a supporter of Virginias. If we ever get Virginias in any sort of reasonable time this century, they'll be a stupendously capable a weapon of war, particularly when we move to what's called the Virginia Block 7, and we can talk about the different blocks in a moment if you wish. The problem is when the deal was done internally within the government, the Albanese Labor government, to then reprioritise a whole lot of programs to pay for that, even though it looks like defence spending has been slightly increased, 2% going up to 2.4, albeit over a decade, a lot of the weapon systems have been hollowed out to pay for the submarines. So where does that now leave us? And I touched on this in my column that you've referred to several times. We've either just about or have paid off our last minesweeper. They're called mine countermeasures vessels. If a port was mined, say Newcastle Port or Sydney Harbour or one of the great ports, Gladstone, where we're so reliant on shipping coming in and going out, and we are a trading nation, as you well know, you could mine any one of those ports. We would have no safe way to demine that port.
Staggering.
We'd literally have to go to our American friends or potentially rely on the British or the French to come down and demine our own ports. Alfred Deakin would be rolling in his grave. And why was that done, John? The mine countermeasures capability, which Mr Rudd's white paper provided for all the way back in 2009, has been defunded to make fiscal room for the submarine. So in other words, there's a fiscal cap that's effectively been put in place at about 2% of GDP going out slowly. But then as the submarine capability comes in and has to be paid for, other things get displaced, just like, water is displaced when a submarine goes through the water. The other thing that we've knocked out of provisioning, we've delayed yet again the purchase of the Tomahawks. Mr Rudd's cabinet signed off on the purchase of the Tomahawks in 2009. We still don't have any. And the third thing that I draw to your attention and to that of your viewers is ballistic missile defence. We see how critical ballistic missile defence is in Ukraine, in Israel and elsewhere. We have no way of shooting down missiles coming into Australia, even just to protect our airfields and our naval bases and our critical infrastructure, let alone protecting our population, because we've defunded the interceptors that would be fired off into either the space to take out missiles in their mid-course, or that would deal with missiles that were coming in what's called the terminal phase as they're screaming through the atmosphere. We have no interceptors. And so again, as with the mine warfare capability, we'd have to go to the Americans and say, look, we're not self-reliant, we're not independent, and we're not autonomous when it comes to shooting down missiles. Can you help us? Again, Alfred Deakin would roll, as would John Curtin. They would roll in their graves.
Well, yes. And by the way, just on those missiles, 2 points. One is, how many years is it now since we were promised that we'd be building them here within 2 years? Many years on, I understand we haven't even selected a site on which to build them. And the second point is, we're a trading nation. We don't have our oil reserves and other reserves in place. We're totally dependent upon shipping. Even in the absence of a war, surely part of the message from China is don't get involved or we can have a go at you. We do not possess a single flagged Australian trading international vessel. Not one, not a tanker, not a bulk carrier, nothing. Thanks in many ways to the unions, it has to be said. We don't possess one. We had 12 or 15 only a couple of years ago, none. So the first thing governments do if something goes wrong is requisition the necessary ships to back up your naval capacity and your trade capacity, keep your country going. We've got no ships to requisition.
That's right. That's right.
A trading nation like ours, utterly dependent on keeping our sea lanes going. We haven't even stockpiled enough here to keep our economy going for more than a couple of weeks in terms of fuel reserves. As a farmer, I don't know what sort of access we would have to the fertilisers and some of the key ingredients that we no longer produce here if something went wrong, for something as basic as feeding ourselves? I don't want to sound alarmist, but who is grappling with this stuff now that is actually in a...
Well,
Sorry.
candidly, John, no one. Candidly, we've talked about a few historical periods. The last time we seriously developed what was called in the 50s, rather ominously, the War Book, which laid out things like stockpiling policies, rationing policies, and so on and so forth. There was a version of the War Book that carried through. I know this for a certain fact because I was a young graduate in the Defence Department, and we used to get access to it. That program was shut down. In other words, the emergency management world, quite rightly, has been very focused on bushfire, flood, cyclone, as it should be. But in the 50s, 60s and 70s, the emergency management world, which was typically in part staffed by retired military, also had a civil defence function. You'd be hard pressed, and I don't want to go too much into the confidences that I still am obligated to keep, but you'd be hard pressed if you were to press into the emergency management area of government, which is in my old Department of Home Affairs, to even get an acknowledgement. They wouldn't necessarily, you wouldn't want it tabled in Parliament, but you wouldn't even get an acknowledgement that such a plan exists. You know why? Because I suspect it doesn't. And that, and that to me is deeply worrying. The fact that a war book doesn't even exist. Now, you might not publish it, and you'd have good reasons to say to the Senate and or the House of Representatives that we're claiming a Crown immunity over it. But I don't even know that we could, hand on heart, say that the thing exists. And that is, in this world, terrifying. Because to take one example that you just mentioned of shipping, even short of a war, we're seeing strange sabotage occurring right around the world, including of shipping. There was just a case in the English Channel just the other day. Undersea infrastructure, undersea pipelines. We've got very little recognition or knowledge of what's happening in the undersea domain. And increasingly these days, you don't need a big submarine to sabotage a pipeline. There are long-range autonomous underwater vehicles that are very stealthy, very hard to detect. And the undersea domain is becoming more like the air domain, very congested, very contested, and very crowded. We've got nothing down there. It's terrifying, John.
Can I ask how many people there are in the Department of Defence in Canberra?
The department, I don't know, to be honest. The ADF itself is 57,000. The department would be somewhere north of 30,000, but I couldn't, hand on heart, say that I know what the full-time equivalent workforce is, John. I'll have to take that on.
Yeah, that's all right. It just strikes me that everyone knows what a mess we make of acquisitions. Then you hear things like, we haven't updated the war book for years. That's my comment, not yours. And we don't even know whether one exists. And there are many aspects to security. It's not just simply defence hardware. There's the number of troops and actual ADF. I mean, at 57,000, that's very modest across three services. 14,000 only in the Navy. They are apparently so lacking personnel that they're decommissioning rather than manning more ships. I think this is astounding stuff.